An old Quaker stood up in a friends' meeting and told the congregation about a young man whom he knew. This young man lived a very undisciplined life and did not believe in the truths of the faith. One day, this young man asked a pious Quaker friend to go sailing. A sudden storm came up, and the undisciplined and unbelieving youth was drowned. Having said this, the old Quaker sat down. He had obviously made his point about where undisciplined and irreligious living will lead. But after a few moments, he stood up again and said to the meeting, "Friends, for the honor of the truth, I think I ought to add that the Quaker also drowned." No one is exempt from trouble. We certainly know that in our little church family in these past few days. No one. All of us at some point in our lives find ourselves caught in the storms of life. That is certainly what the disciples learned that day on the Sea of Galilee. The day had begun with Jesus preaching and teaching for the crowds, but the press of the crowd became so great that Jesus climbed into a boat and pushed out a little ways from the shore. From there, he continued to speak. As the day drew to a close, Jesus turned to his disciples and he said, "Let us go over to the other side." After a day of pouring himself out for the multitudes, Jesus was asleep in the stern. Halfway across the lake, they were caught in a terrible sudden storm. These storms were not uncommon. The problem was that they usually came without warning and were often fierce in their intensity. This storm broke with such fury that the boat was almost swamped. Fear gripped the disciples, even those who were experienced sailors. But at the height of the storm's fury, Jesus continued to sleep. They woke him up shouting, "We're going to drown, don't you care?" Over the howl of the wind, Jesus called out to the storm, "Quiet, be still." Even more suddenly than the storm had come up, it ceased. It was completely calm. Jesus then asked, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" Apparently, because the disciples were so stunned by what he had just done, they said to another, "Who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him." When I read that story in 3 of the Gospels about the power of Jesus and the weakness of the disciples' faith, I identify with the disciples. I wonder how often I have let my faith sleep as long as the sea was calm. Too often we take our faith for granted. When we let our relationship with God lapse during times of calm, we put our spiritual well-being in jeopardy. When the storm is raging, we hold fast to our faith. But when the weather is fair, when things are calm, we forget to hold on. How often have I reacted in anger when the storm hits? Even people of faith sometimes react in anger when the storms of life touch us. We know that God will see us through the storm. We know, as the British preacher Graham Scroggie has put it, a storm with Christ is better than a calm without him. Knowing that, we still seem to respond in anger to the storms of life. I admit that things have not always turned out as I might have wished. There have been times when, instead of stilling the storm around me, God has stilled the storm within me. In his book entitled A Spiritual Autobiography, William Barclay tells of the time his 21-year-old daughter and her fiancé were drowned in a boating accident. He wrote, "God did not stop the accident at sea, but God did still the storm in my own heart, so that somehow my wife and I came through that terrible time still on our 2 feet. As I look back on stormy times, I never cease to be amazed at the way God has worked in my life and in the lives of many of those whom I love. A sculptor once ruined a large piece of marble. It was left in the courtyard of the cathedral in Florence, Italy, for almost 100 years. Most sculptors were convinced that it was beyond repair. But in 1501, a young artist asked if anything could be done with what they called the giant. He measured the block and carefully noted the imperfections. To his mind came the image of a young shepherd boy, David. For 3 years he worked, skillfully shaping the marble. Finally, when one of his students was allowed to see the towering figure, 18 feet high and weighing 9 tons, the student exclaimed, "Master, it lacks only one thing, and that is speech." From a ruined block of marble, Michelangelo had created one of the great masterpieces of all time. In much the same way, I stand amazed at what God is able to do with the trials and tribulations of our lives. Back in the days of the sailing ships, there was a ship caught in a storm. Most of the passengers became panicky, running to and fro in fear. Only one small boy seemed to remain calm and cheerful, even at the height of the storm. When someone asked him why he wasn't afraid, he replied, "Why should I be afraid? My Father is at the helm." May God give us faith to realize that no matter how threatening the storms that assail us, we know who is at the helm. Thanks be to God. Amen.